So we're in Job chapter 15, and I'm going to start with this as a theme for this morning, which I think will probably again help us. Is God's kingdom is based in faith. God's kingdom is based in faith. Or you could say God's kingdom is based in trust. Now, so the word faith we're not going to really find too much in the book of Job, but we will find the word trust. And so this morning as we go through, I just want us to be reminded that there is truly a battle in this world and existence that we're a part of ultimately, can you trust God? Can you actually believe God? Is that something that you can stand on and know for certain that He is faithful? And of course, it's all based in His character, His nature. Is He really that way? And the enemy of our soul, he wants to convince us that God is not to be trusted. He wants to convince us that He will let us down. He will bring discouragement into our lives because just basically the bottom line is that we cannot really truly have confidence that He will do what He said that He will do. So in this time here that we're looking at in Job's life and the struggle that's going on and all that he's going through, behind the scenes is a spiritual battle and struggle that at its very core has to do with whether or not you can put your faith and your trust in God, and that God will show Himself to be faithful, that God will in fact support the one whose heart is fully His. Is that in fact the case, that will be demonstrated and seen? So just, again, put that in the back of your mind as we go through these things. I'm going to look at chapter 14, just the last part of what Job has been saying as a context. Job 14, verse 13. Job says, "Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, that you would conceal me until your wrath returns to you, that you would set a limit for me and remember me." Talked a lot about that last time, that in the midst of all that Job is saying, and sometimes very rash words, he also has a part that he is revealing that he, in fact, has seen a side of God that makes him assured that God will not forget him, that God will actually remember him. And for him to plead with God that God would actually protect him and actually pull him aside until God's wrath is poured out, that finally then Job could be back with God, that was something that came to his heart. Verse 14, "If a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my struggle, I will wait until my change comes." Just an amazing words there, that in the midst of his pleading and praying to God, God is giving him revelation. He's musing, he's just thinking about these things, but it's coming to him. And I believe that this whole thought, hey, I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait for my change, because it is something that would be part of God's nature, not to forget us, but that God would actually one day make us live again so that we could be with Him. Verse 15, "You will call and I will answer you. You will long for the work of your hands." Who's the work of God's hands? It was Job. You will long for the work of your hands. That Job believes that God is faithful, that God will fulfill what His demonstration of love is all about, and that He will in fact long for the work of His hands and bring him to Himself. Verse 16, "For now you number my steps, you do not observe my sin. My transgression is sealed up in a bag, and you wrap up my iniquity." just the insight for Job, having actually nothing to really support it. He knows that God is overlooking his sin, that they're wrapped up somewhere. They'll be dealt with in the future, and that God is gracious and God actually will forgive. And he is putting his faith and trust that that will happen one day. But in the meantime, he isn't actually yet facing those sins because God will, in fact, deal with them. Well, he says those things, and then verse 18, but for the meantime, you can put that in there, but for the meantime, the falling mountain crumbles away and the rock moves from its place. Water wears away stones, its torrents wash away the dust of the earth. So you destroy man's hope. You forever overpower him, and he departs. You change his appearance and send him away. His sons achieve honor, but he does not know it, or they become insignificant, but he does not perceive it. But his body pains him, and he mourns only for himself. So in the meantime, even though we, in a sense, can trust God to be faithful, and that God is eternal and God will be faithful in time to come. But in the meantime, as Job lived and experienced what he was living right then and there, he was experiencing that his outer man is decaying, that his outer man is perishing. And it's a consistent thing that's happening, and it brings despair in people's lives. It also, on this side of heaven, it also means that as you have children, as you actually have those who will live after you, you won't be there ultimately to see everything that happens with them. And so it's again, that dichotomy of his faith, but at the same time, his present circumstances where he is going through these tragic times that he's experienced, doesn't have a family. He knows that now his sons no longer live, and so he recognizes what, in fact, it means to be one who is corruptible, perishable, and everything is affected by those sorts of things in this life. But he also continues to hope for the future. So those are the things that Job has been talking about. And I want to just cradle that in the whole point that, he had stopped talking to his friends. And he told his friends, I want to talk to God directly. I want to speak to him directly. So that's what we just actually read, was Job speaking to God directly. Now, that is going to bring another response from one of these friends. The fact that Job is actually attempting to just talk directly with God and pour his heart out, that's not going to go over well. And so now we're going to cycle again. If you've been here, we've gone through a few friends here. Now we're cycling back, and we're going to the first one who spoke. And we believe that the first one who spoke was Eliphaz the Temanite, and that in fact, because he spoke first, he was likely the oldest. So keep that in mind. So he's going to speak again. We're going to go around. Now we're going to get this response again from Eliphaz. So chapter 15, verse 1. Then Eliphaz the Temanite responded, should a wise man answer with windy knowledge and fill himself with the east wind? Should he argue with useless talk or with words which are not profitable? Well, we have already seen it, that as this has gone along, they become less and less gracious, these counselors, and they are not trying to be tender and sensitive anymore. They're just letting him have it. And so, what all this talk, Job, all these things you're saying, they're just vain. They're useless. You're just talking to talk. It's just wind. There's no profit in it. How can you just keep going on like this? So not a lot of compassion for his circumstances any longer. Verse 4. Indeed, you do away with reverence and hinder meditation before God. I'm going to read that one again. Indeed, you do away with reverence or fear and hinder meditation before God. Job, with all this talk, and especially the fact that you're talking supposedly directly to God, you're not having enough reverential fear for God. Have you ever had anybody imply that in your life? Where maybe you're pouring your heart out. You're explaining maybe what it was that you told God. And their perspective is that you crossed the line because you said too much. You didn't actually keep that fear of God and keep your rightful place. I was raised in a home where my mom was the one who really blazed the trail in terms of us having an understanding of God and putting a fear of God in us. I think the Lord used her in that way. She was very respectful of God. And I grew up very much, I'd say, on the edge of my seat because I truly, truly feared God. I didn't know him, but I feared him. And so years go by, 17, I get saved, and I'm told about the love of God, and I, by his Spirit, all of a sudden begin to be awakened to that I can have an actual relationship with God. And I began to see the radical difference between having just purely a fear for God and actually having a genuine Abba Father relationship with God, that I know God. And part of it was, I was told, cast all your care upon him because he cares for you. Be anxious for nothing, but by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, make your request known to God. He doesn't say get it all right, but just make your request known to God, and the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard your heart and mind in Christ Jesus. So there's that access that we have to God. Well, I hear in what's going on here with Job and his friends is Job, he understood that. He understood that you can have a relationship with God. That's why he said, don't forget me. You know, that's why he used terminology that would indicate that God had a place in his heart for Job, that he had made Job and that Job was special to him. But this friend, Eliphaz, comes and says, you know what? You're just not having enough fear. You're not having a reverential fear for God. You're going on, you know what you should do? You should be meditating more. With all that talk, you're not meditating enough. And it's such a difference, you know. It's, you know what? We're encouraged to what? To pray unceasingly. So, you know what? If talking too much was a problem with God, I don't think he would have said that, because it doesn't say that you got to get everything right. It means to have, as we've said it in the past, if you're on the phone with God, don't ever hang up. You know, that doesn't mean talking the whole time, of course, but it means keep the line open so that you can share your heart. God loves you. Why does he love us? Because he loves us. And he wants to hear from you. And so this counselor is saying, you know what? All this talk about possible resurrection of you know, God rescuing you and protecting you and all that, it's all a waste of time. It's all wind. And you know what? You should get back to that reverential fear again and do some meditation. Verse 5. For your guilt teaches your mouth. And you choose the language of the crafty. So, you know, the reason why you're talking so much is you're guilty inside and you're trying to just rationalize where you're at. Talk, 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 talk. This would be another thing that you could put on a t-shirt. For your guilt teaches your mouth. You'd probably get some response from those who are around you. What did you just say? Your guilt teaches your mouth. You can't, you know, you're a guilty person, so you can't stop talking. And you choose the language of the crafty. Eliphaz says, and not only that, Job, you know what? You're pretty sneaky. You talk about all these things almost like, you kind of so wind us into these different topics, and you're trying to get it off the point that you're a guilty person, and that's why terrible things are happening in your life. Let's just get back to the point. Stop being so crafty. Verse 6. I just got to say it. It just reminds me of, you remember Saul in the Old Testament chasing after David? And at one point, Saul is sending a bunch of people to go find him. And Saul says, how terrible he is. And then he says, and you know what? He's a very crafty fellow. He's a crafty fellow. Saul's perspective, being wicked, saw David as someone who was crafty and cunning, when in fact, David's whole perspective was to put his trust in God and relied upon God regularly. And you see that sometimes where through the eyes of a person who has something against you and is after you, they perceive you in certain ways that you're not. And that's what's happening here. Eliphaz sees this in Job, that he's crafty, when in fact he's actually pretty straightforward. Verse 6, your own mouth condemns you, and not I, and your own lips testify against you. You're sealing your own fate by all this that you're talking about, Job. Will you just stop? And you kind of sense in this that Eliphaz is kind of starting to get a little hostile. Little hostile here. And you know what's behind this? It's the flesh and the spirit. The flesh and the spirit. Where Job has had a relationship with God, and the Holy Spirit has influenced him. And his actions aren't perfect in any way, but his confidence ultimately keeps coming back to the Lord. And that's starting to be irritating, because Eliphaz doesn't have that kind of confidence in that kind of relationship with the Lord. And it's hostility. Verse 7. Were you the first man to be born, or were you brought forth before the hills? Job, do you really think you're that all that you, in a sense, can come up with these conclusions and say these things? Were you the first man who was ever born, so you've had all this time to gain this incredible wisdom? Were you brought forth before the hills? Were you there before even God created anything? That you're coming up with this arrogance and claiming to know as much as you know. Verse 8. Do you hear the secret counsel of God and limit wisdom to yourself? It's interesting because as they go back and forth, Job and then the counselor, Job, then the counselor, there's this thing of like, what is wisdom? And there is this whole side of it of both on both sides claiming that the other's wisdom is just foolishness. And in this case, he says, do you hear the secret counsel of God and limit wisdom to yourself? Really, Job, do you really know that much? Are you that so much in touch with what's part of existence that you can make these kinds of claims and actually then say about yourself that you have that background to actually be as assertive as you are? Verse 9, what do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that we do not know, or that we do not? In other words, again, you fail. We know everything you know. Verse 10, both the gray-haired and the aged are among us, older than your fathers, or older than your father. So, there's a statement there, a couple of things interesting. So the gray-haired are among us. So of these counselors, are those who have gray hair. They're seniors, all right? And and the ages are among us older than your father. Meaning that one of these guys at least is older than Job's father. Now, I already told you in the beginning, it was the oldest one who would speak first, which means that actually Eliphaz is talking about himself. Among us here, there's someone who is older than even your father. So how can you claim to know everything, Job? Well, he was actually talking about himself because he was the oldest. And the point being is that, listen, let me just kind of, in a sense, deflate you because, I actually knew your father. So I've been around for a long time. And now that's pretty amazing, too, recognizing that Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Obviously, sometime, in the middle age, in the period of time of life, I don't know what, possibly 40s or something like that. And to actually say that this guy knew his father and since corresponded to him, it shows there is a big gap there if he is actually telling the truth. But the point being that he is one to be looked up to. Verse 11. Are the consolations of God too small for you? Even the words spoken gently with you. So Job, you've already had an opportunity. We tried to console you in the beginning. Try to have some gentle words. We tried to actually be by your side and tell you some things that would encourage you. But you know what? You keep coming back to these same things that says that you're innocent and that you have no violence in your hands, that you have no course change that would indicate that this would in fact come upon you because of something wrong that you've done. Well, you keep coming back to it, but you know what? It's not true. It's not true. In fact, you have sinned, and we were trying to be gentle with you in the beginning to let you know that, but it's going too far with all of this. Are the consolations of God too small for you? That obviously he equates what they're saying to Job as from God. And then the other part, even the words spoken gently with you. Verse 12. Why does your heart carry you away? And why do your eyes flash? Now, I think what this is that Eliphaz and all of them knew that Job was passionate about what he said. That Job was not going to let this go, even to the point of claiming that he wanted to talk directly with God about it. And his eyes would flash as he would talk about it because he doesn't understand this. And he wants to get to the heart core of it because it matters. He's going to perish in any moment. And he wants to understand, why is this happening? Of course, Eliphaz interprets it as, you're just going over the top. You're not even, in a sense, as far as your perspective, you're not seeing things clearly anymore. You're taking things into your own hands. You're getting carried away. Verse 13. That you should turn let me read 12 and 13 for the context. Why does your heart carry you away, and why do your eyes flash? That you should turn your spirit against God and allow such words to go out of your mouth. You've turned away from God with all of this. You've turned your spirit against God. You're doing these things, Job, and you don't even realize it's happening to you, and it's now offensive towards God. What, in fact, your actions are, especially as you would actually turn your spirit to God. You say you want to talk directly, but in fact, you're just expressing guilt, and you're letting God be as a man in the sense that you're pouring out things that are inappropriate to say to God. Verse 14. Now, I want you to really pay attention to this. 14. What is man that he should be pure? Or he who is born of a woman that he should be righteous? Behold, he, that is God, puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight, how much less one who is detestable and corrupt, man who drinks iniquity like water. So in essence, he says, listen, it is absolutely not the case that men can be pure. And if the person who's born of a woman, a man, can never in any sort of way have a righteousness about them. And the background for that point is this, verse 15, behold, God puts no trust in his holy ones, that's the angels, and the heavens are not pure in his sight. In other words, listen, if angels are in fact not ones that God accepts, that God actually is of the highest level of scrutiny, even with the angels, and he comes against even them, then how can a man be righteous? How can a man have purity in his life? They're detestable, they're corrupt, they drink iniquity like water. Now, there is some truth in some of what he says in terms of all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But the main premise is this, that in fact, the verse 15, behold, God puts no trust in his holy ones. So listen, because of how evil things are and how it transfers to every created being, God won't trust anybody. That's what he's saying. Does that sound familiar to you? It sounds familiar if in fact you remember that Eliphaz, in the first time that he spoke, he actually talked about a dream that he had. And that the dream that he had actually revealed to him certain things that now he's actually bringing to Job and saying that these are truths that you need to rely upon. I want us to be reminded of it. So go back to Job chapter 4. Job chapter 4, verse 12. Let's read through it again. This is when he related to Job his dream. 4:12. Now a word was brought to me stealthily, and my ear received a whisper of it, amid disquieting thoughts from the visions of the night when deep sleep falls on men. Dread came upon me, and trembling, and made all my bones shake. Eliphaz is speaking here. Then a spirit passed by my face. The hair of my flesh bristled up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence. Then I heard a voice. Stop there. He's already said this is a spirit, which is bad in and of itself. This is not an angel. This is, in fact, a demonic spirit. And in fact, just knowing the whole context of Job, this could be Satan himself. Comes and appears before Eliphaz. And then he can't really make out what he looks like or anything, but he hears this voice, verse 17. Can mankind be just from God? Can a man be pure from his maker? And here's what Eliphaz said in the other passage that he quoted from this. He puts no trust even in his servants, and against his angels he charges errors. How much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed before the moth. Between morning and evening they are broken in pieces, unobserved, they perish forever. Is not their tent cord plucked up within them? They die, yet without wisdom. Now, all those things I just read are from that spirit. So what's that spirit saying? What's that demonic one or Satan himself saying? He says, you know what? God doesn't put trust in anybody. that even when it comes to the angels, he looks at them and he actually examines them, and he will actually hold charges against angels for things that they do wrong. Now, he personally had an experience with that. Satan did, right? So he's resentful of that. He says, God doesn't trust anybody. And so listen, if God doesn't trust angels, is he going to trust men? Those little pathetic, clay pot standing things. That all they do is, they just drink iniquity. And you know what? They perish. They're perishable. So listen, if God is so harsh with the angels, hey, a man can't even begin to think that God would accept him. So what's the point? Men can never be righteous. The point is, God just doesn't trust anybody. Now, go to Genesis 3 real quick. Genesis 3. You remember this? Verse 1. Genesis 3:1. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the beasts of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, "Indeed, has God said, 'You shall not eat from any tree of the garden'?" Well, which absolutely he knew that was not what God said, but it was to bring attention to that one tree that she couldn't eat. So the devil lies to her, and the woman said to the serpent, "From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, 'You shall not eat from it or touch it, or you shall die.'" So she clarifies with the devil, and his intention isn't for her to clarify. He just wants to bring attention to that one tree. And verse 4 then, the serpent said to the woman, "You surely will not die. For God knows that in the day that you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So you know what this is? This is an assault on her trust in God. It's an assault on what he said, what God said to her, but it's an assault on her believing him. Because he said, "Listen, you surely will not die. You can have this because, and then he even assaults God's character and says that the only reason why God said that was to keep you from the knowledge of good and evil. Because if you get the knowledge of good and evil, you'll be like God. So the point of going to this passage is the devil always looks to undermine faith and to undermine our confidence in what God said, that in fact he actually will stand by it and he is to be actually trusted. So back to our passage, go to Job 15. So this whole thought is, again, through Eliphaz and this dream that he had that came from this demonic spirit. It's to, in fact, bring a counsel that says, listen, God doesn't trust anyone. And in fact, no man can actually be pure because God's hard even with the angels. So how much more this pathetic race that he's actually created? And because of that, it is impossible to ever think that a man could become righteous, that God will give righteousness to a man, because he is absolutely so much lower than the angels. That's what he's saying. So I want to bring a couple things up. I want us to now go to Ezekiel, okay? Ezekiel 28. There's two passages in the Bible that describe Satan. This is one of them. One is in Isaiah and one is in Ezekiel. We're only going to go to the Ezekiel passage because I think it's important in the midst of this to realize the enemy of Job's soul and what he's trying to pull here. Ezekiel 28. And verse 12. I'm going to start halfway in that verse 12. It says, "Thus says the Lord God, you," and he's talking to Satan, "you had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and on." And jump down. "All of those stones were in you with gold sockets." And it says, those things, they were in you, and then on the day that you were created, they were prepared. So God exalted Lucifer. God exalted him and gave him a high, high place. And many, many demonstrations of God's glory there reflected in this creation. Verse 14, "You were the anointed cherub who covers or guards, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire." I don't know all that means, but I do believe that Lucifer was involved in the highest levels of what God's plans and purposes were. That these stones of fire represents the holiness of God. And it also represents, as we see from Isaiah, God's redemptive plan to actually bring forgiveness to lost mankind. So Lucifer was called in, and he was one of those cherubs that guarded and covered and was a part of this ministry. Verse 15, "You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. By the abundance of your trade, you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore I cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I put you before kings that they may see you." And he continues on. So this is the description, but I want to just bring up a couple things. Yes, the pride. Yes, there was violence that came in his heart. There was, in fact, these things that demonstrated that he fell into unrighteousness, even though initially he was righteous. But he also adds to there in verse 16, "By the abundance of your trade, you internally were filled with violence." Now, just a thought. Everything we have is from God. And so whether you're an angel or you're a man, everything that actually is in your hands ultimately came from God. And so this statement from God through Ezekiel to the devil is, listen, initially your intentions were good. You glorified God. You did, in fact, what he called you to do, and that was to participate in bringing salvation to mankind. But at some point, you began to be resentful of mankind. You began to be jealous. And then what you had to trade with, the things that God gave you, began to be an avenue in which you hoarded it and you wanted more and more. And then were more and more violent to have your ways, even murderous to be able to actually fulfill what your intentions are. And then God himself dealt with you. God actually put that curse upon you and limited what you could in fact do. So I just want to say this. Whether you're a man or you're an angel, God has given a certain stewardship in your life. Meaning that a steward is someone who has been entrusted with certain things that belong to someone else. And then God, as he has equipped you, as he's gifted you, he watches you as to how you, in fact, exercise that stewardship and whether you're faithful to it or not. Well, it sounds to me like Lucifer was faithful for a term. But then his heart was turned against God. And pride. We read in Isaiah that he vowed to be like God and even higher than the Most High. And he wanted everyone to follow him. And so he took what it was that was given to him, and rather than exalting God, he exalted himself. He worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And that was his fall. I just want to use that as a backdrop to, we've talked about this briefly before, but I want to go to it. I want you to go to the book of Matthew 25, New Testament. Matthew 25, we're going to start with verse 14. Familiar parable, but I think it speaks a lot to this situation. Matthew 25, verse 14. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. This translation says entrusted, and if you want to draw a line under that, it's important. That this master, who obviously is actually a representation of God, entrusted to his slave a certain amount. Verse 15. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability, and he went on his journey. Immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. He didn't hoard it. He didn't consider it his own, but he went and he traded with it, and he ended up having 5 more to give to his master, in a total of 10. Verse 21, his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Also, the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I have gained 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master answered and said to him, You wicked, lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I don't sow and gather where I scattered no seed. And he gives an explanation of what he should have done. But then verse 29, For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. You know, I think this is obviously an analogy of how God actually, he has purposed to entrust with his creation a stewardship of all the different things that God has made. He's put it at our disposal, and even giftings and abilities. He has put them into our lives so that we would, in fact, serve him and that we would go and trade those things and bring back something that would multiply and bring more and more glory to God. Now, these three, the one who had the 5, one who had the 2, and then the one who had the 1, are examples. The first two are ones who actually believed their master. They trusted their master, and they were not afraid that the master was trying to take advantage of them. They were not afraid that the master had actually stolen these talents somewhere and then given them, and that they would in fact be brought into the crime of it. They didn't think anything about that. They just believed. And they went and they took what that was actually entrusted to them, and they imparted it to others, and then it brought more and more, as I said, ultimately glory to their master. But the last one, what was his problem? The last one's problem was, he said, I knew you to be a hard man. I knew you to be one who takes where he doesn't actually even, he doesn't actually own something. And you steal from others and then you give. And so I knew where you were coming from. And so I thought the safest thing to do was go bury it. And this is a perfect picture. Well, it's a perfect picture of our lives, because we're entrusted with things. And God has given us gifting. And we can make a decision whether we're going to actually invest it for God's glory and for God's kingdom, or if we're going to hoard it to ourselves. And a lot has to do with how you see God. Do you see him as gracious and giving and kind? Have you participated in his love for you so that you love others in the way that he loved you? And you make a trade then. And then more and more brings glory to God because you believe. Or is your perspective of God limited? Is somehow something going on that actually warps your perspective, and you really don't believe that God is as good as it is said in his word that he is? Or maybe you're not even aware. And as a result of that, you choose not to, in fact, trust the one who entrusted everything you have to you. You choose to actually, rather than take action and actually believe in faith, you're going to take it and you're going to take the safe way. The safe way of, I don't want to actually cause any problems, so I'm not going to even venture out. I'll just, in a sense, go my way, and I'll deal with it later. We see God, according to this parable, God is going to be upset because you were entrusted with wonderful things. And you see, Satan is an example of exactly what we're talking about. Satan was the highest of the angels. God brought glory to him as a cherub to be involved in the most wonderful, beautiful aspects of what God's plan was. But unfortunately, the devil began to actually think about it and wonder why it wasn't coming to him, why it wasn't his and his alone. And he began to actually have a perspective of God, that God was in fact someone who first of all, you couldn't trust, and also, when in fact God's judgment came to his life, it left a lasting impression that, listen, if God is so hard even with the angels, that in fact no one can be righteous. If God said that I fell, then listen, everyone falls. And that if your thought at all is to try to be pleasing to God, that is a lie. That's the devil's perspective. And so back to Job. We're gonna finish with this. In all of this dialogue that's going on, and this counselor who is actually giving Job counsel that he got from the devil himself, there is a urging, or in a sense you could say a wrestling that's not flesh and blood, to convince Job, listen, you are completely off your rocker if you think that a man can be righteous. That God would give his righteousness to someone? That is completely out of question, because we know for certain that, As he says in verse 15, behold, he puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight. In other words, these thoughts of anyone actually being righteous is completely out of the question. In fact, for a man to even entertain it is actually to disacknowledge everything in terms of how God deals with the higher holy angels. Verse 17, I will tell you, listen to me, and what I have seen I will also declare. What wise men have told and have not concealed from their fathers? To whom alone the land was given, and no alien passed among them. The wicked man writhes in pain all his days, and numbered are the years stored up for the ruthless. Sounds of terror are in his ears, while at peace the destroyer comes upon him. He does not believe that he will return from darkness, and he is destined for the sword. Now let me try to explain that. What Eliphaz is saying here is listen, I want to correct you, Job, in some of the things that you said. And I'm going to correct you in this way. Only the special person who's born can understand some of these things. And it would be the wise man who God would, in a sense, protect. But the truth of the matter is unless you are a wise man like myself, he would say, unless that's true, then you know what? The wicked have certain assurances that they think that they're going to receive, but they don't get it. They don't receive it. Verse 20 again, the wicked man writhes in pain all his days, and numbered are the years stored up for the ruthless. So he says, actually, with mankind being as much in sin as they are, the more common thing is that a man is of a wicked perspective. And that wickedness means that God is going to actually make things very difficult because God's judgment will rest upon his life. You said, Job, that actually God chose the number of every person's days. That God, because of his love for us, he has actually ahead of time determined how many days we will live. What I say, Job, is that the wicked had a certain amount of days that they were supposed to live, but actually because of God's judgment in their life, he cut them off short. He reduced the number of days because of their wickedness. And there's terror in their eyes because of that. Now, should a wicked person actually look, in a sense, for something bright in the future? No. Again, verse 22, he does not believe that he will return from darkness, and he is destined for the sword. He knows that someday he's going to get it. Impending doom is in the life of a wicked person. He wanders about for food, saying, where is it? He knows that a day of darkness is at hand. Distress and anguish terrify him. They overpower him like a king ready for the attack. Because he has stretched out his hand against God and conducts himself arrogantly against the Almighty. Now, my question is this. What Eliphaz is saying is listen, most people are wicked. There's only a few that stand out as somebody who's wise. They are the exception to the rule, but for the most part, this is the destiny of men, that they are wicked, that they have this pride, and that God is going to put it even upon them that they have no hope. So why is he saying all these things? It can't be anything other than Eliphaz is letting loose all of his hostility towards Job, and the implication is he is saying to Job, really the real issue is you're wicked. And the reason why these calamities have happened in your life is because you have turned your back on God. You've resisted the Almighty. You've become flagrant in what you've said about him. And because of that, that's why things are as bad as they are in your life. And he continues, verse 26. The wicked person, he rushes headlong or with a stiff neck at God, at him, with his massive shield. For he has covered his face with his fat and made his thighs heavy with flesh. In other words, he's lazy. A wicked person is lazy. And these things then come against him because of that. He has lived in desolate cities, in houses no one would inhabit, which are destined to become ruins. He will not become rich, nor will his wealth endure. And his grain will not bend down to the ground. Well, that was a slam on Job because Job had lost everything. Fire had fallen from heaven. He had lost his servants. He had lost his family. And Eliphaz is probably thinking to himself, I got to just tell this guy the truth. I'm going to tell the guy the truth. It's because there's wickedness in your life. Verse 30, he will not escape from darkness. The flame will wither his shoots, and by the breath of his mouth he will go away. Job, you talked about life, but there's no life for the wicked. There's no hope, and that's what's happening to you. Verse 31, let him not trust in emptiness, deceiving himself, for emptiness will be his reward. I think that's a reference right back to what he began by saying, all of your words are wind. They're just empty. And he's now telling him that is an indication that you are wicked and you won't receive a reward. Verse 32, it will be accomplished before his time, and his palm branch will not be green. In other words, he'll die before the number of his days. He will drop off his unripe grape like the vine, and will cast off his flower like the olive tree. For the company of the godless is barren, and fire consumes the tents of the corrupt. They conceive mischief and brings forth iniquity, and their mind prepares deception. And he ends with that. Now, talking about a counselor. Let me give it to you straight, Job. We're not mixing words anymore. You are a filthy wretch. And all of this is happening to you because you have compromised. You've even deceived yourself. And all these things now that are surrounding you is because you have come against God. And the heart of his message was that a dream came to him from a demon. And he counted on that dream. That it's ridiculous to ever think that a man could be right with God. Well, I would say that Eliphaz was absolutely used by the devil right here. So you know what? There's a certain revelation that came to him from a false spirit. And because of that, now we're on a whole new level in the book of Job, that the spiritual warfare is even becoming more drastic in its expression. Well, that being the case, I'll tell you what, a lot of times when the Lord allows for the enemy to ramp up things and make things even harsher and more difficult in your life, you know what? His grace is sufficient for you. And if he does that, he will then actually counter that in your heart and in your life to give you strength and grace to be able to come against the lies that are coming your way. God's not going to just let it be. No temptation has overtaken you, which is such as is common to man. In other words, God is faithful, and he's going to give you what you need to fight the battle. Why am I saying this? Because in chapter 16, there is an incredible wave of revelation that comes to Job that counters everything that he said and even brings out truth as a result of it that even more so brings glory to God. And just if ending in our spot tonight discourages you, remember, next week, Next week, it's actually an amazing chapter, and then from that point forward, because the revelation that's given is just out of this world. I'm going to just read chapter 16, verse 18, and then we're done. Actually, 18 to the end there. O earth, don't cover my blood, and let there be no resting place for my cry. Sounds a little bit like Abel. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and my advocate is on high. My friends are my scoffers. My eye weeps to God. Oh, that a man might plead with God as a man with his neighbor. For when a few years are past, I shall go the way of no return. There is a cry out to God that says, you know what? God, I recognize that I'm not getting any help from those around me. There's an advocate in heaven. I believe that there is an advocate that will stand for me, and I will be able to talk and be able to have someone that will understand and plead my case before God.